Right, so the question on the floor. Question on the floor is: can you replace the engine in an ER6N with one from a Vulcan S? The short answer is yeah. Well, yeah, you can. But it's not quite as simple as that. Obviously, there are some things to bear in mind. This is a 2010 ER6N that I bought from a guy after it dropped a valve. So I knew there was significant damage to the engine. I wasn't sure what I was going to do when I bought it, whether I would replace the engine or attempt to repair, or, you know, wouldn't know until the engine was taken apart. But the guy I bought it from did send me some photos with the head removed, and it looked like there were some serious problems. But I bought it anyway because I got it for a good price, with the sort of idea that if I need to, I can source a replacement engine. But yeah, so dropped valve, serious problems with the engine. If you've never seen what an engine looks like after it drops a valve, we can have a look at the damage here. So that is our cylinder head. You can see which cylinder lost a valve. Incidentally, oops, when we say dropped a valve, I don't mean that the keepers came off and the valve fell into the cylinder or anything like that. The actual head of the valve snapped off. You can see the stem is still left there in the valve guide, and caused significant damage to the cylinder head. That's what it should look like. You can see the spark plug in the center. Unfortunately, the head of the valve was actually jammed into it there, so I don't even think it's possible to remove that spark plug anymore. And then this other significant damage. It might have been possible to repair this using this head, but you can see there's quite a lot of damage to the valve seat as well, so it would have necessitated a lot of work to repair the cylinder head. So my thoughts were gonna have to scrap that. There's the piston. Obviously there's very little clearance between the crown of the piston and the combustion chamber when it's at top dead center, so yeah, the head of the valve actually punched a hole through the piston, bounced around in there quite a lot, and eventually made its way out the exhaust port, and I found the bits of the head of the valve in the exhaust when I took the exhaust off. So obviously here, bare minimum, you're looking at a replacement cylinder head, replacement piston. One of the other issues here was inside the bore. There's a couple of little nicks over here, because obviously that piece of broken off valve is now inside the bore while the piston's going up and down. I thought I might be able to get away with a hone to sort that out, but then I found another nick down there, and you can actually see, if you look carefully at the piston, on this side, you can see the damage and scuffs there caused by the damage to the bore. So new cylinder head, at least one new piston, and a new valve, plus a head gasket, and possibly discovering other problems along the way. So yeah, so I thought probably not much point. Once you add it all up, you're looking at £500 or £600 in used parts. Forget about new cylinder head is worth a new motorbike, so forget about new. But yeah, quite a lot of parts, significant cost. So yeah, decision was made, rather replace the engine, and that's when I started looking for an engine. And this is where it seems to be a bit of a problem, because the ER6 engines are used for super twin racing. It's quite difficult to find a good ER6 engine out there at a reasonable price. One breaker told me that they have a standing arrangement with a customer on the Isle of Man, so whenever they get an ER6 engine in, it just goes straight out there. These guys are building race bikes with big budgets, and they can afford to pay quite a lot for a used engine, so the prices are just astronomical for what they are. Also, something else that occurred to me, I did a bit more research about this particular 2010 model. Now this is the second generation ER6N. It shares the same engine with the ER6F, and the Versys of the same era. And it seems to have a little bit of an issue with the valves, because there are quite a lot of them out there that seem to have dropped valves. There were quite a few used heads on eBay with exactly the same damage. A few on Facebook Marketplace. People are breaking the bikes because the engine's gone because it's dropped a valve. A couple of videos on YouTube of people with having the same exact problem, and it seems to be mainly the second generation engine from, I think it's 2009 to 2011, I think, that seems to be the issue. So on top of the cost of repairing this engine, I would have had to have added in the cost of 4 brand new exhaust valves, just to be on the safe side, because the part number for the exhaust valve has been superseded 2 or 3 times since this engine was made, so the new valves are different to the older valves. So at least that would have been another £100. So yeah, so I thought find a new engine, but I didn't want to try and get my hands on another 2010 or second gen engine, because I don't want to have the same problem again. The really old Gen 1 engines seem to be quite reliable, but once again, they're in demand for super twin racing. Even the Versys engines are quite hard to get your hands on. Same goes with the new third Gen 1. Much higher demand even than the other two, so very hard to get your hands on for a reasonable price. But I noticed the Vulcan S seems to be a lot easier to get your hands on, the engine for the Vulcan S. So my thinking was, if I can get that to fit, it's a better price and get a nice low mileage engine for a good price. And also, I would assume by now they're putting the newest spec of the exhaust valves into that engine, so I shouldn't have issues with it dropping a valve. So that was the methodology. In case you're wondering, why would you want to do that, put the Vulcan S engine into the ER6, but that was the methodology. Looking at the engine numbers, they all start with ER650. They are basically the same engine, just with a few differences. So and those differences do mean some modification is required, but it will go in there. So let's just go over what those differences are, because they range from fairly simple things to fairly complicated things. Firstly, yeah, when you look at the cylinder head, you can see it's got this sort of thinning happening and these two fairly rounded sections where your camshafts live. If you look at the other side, it's quite similar on the other side. You've got this sort of thinning effect and some cutouts for these bolts, for the bolt heads. And when we compare that to the Vulcan 650 or Vulcan S, you've got this decorative finish on these fins, and you don't have those two rounded sections, so it is quite different. This finning that you have over here is actually quite a lot wider than it is on the standard ER6 engine, so that does make the whole engine a little bit wider and can cause clearance issues. Now on this side, there's been no issues on this side with this engine mount over here. Everything was clear of everything else, but on the other side, the engine mount at the top here, the front engine mount, there was an issue with clearance between it and the cylinder head. And basically the engine mount has nuts welded to the back of it. It's just a simple bent steel plate with some nuts welded to the back. But the nut was fouling against this. So what I did there was I ground the nut off, and then because the hole was a little large, in fact it was 8.8, sorry, was the diameter of the hole. There's only an 8mm bolt that holds it in, but it had quite a lot of clearance on it, so 8.8. So what I did was I ground the nut off and I just tapped the plate with M10 by 1.25, which was the right size for that particular hole diameter. So I still got decent thread depth. Since it's a 1.25 thread, it's the same pitch as the original M8 bolt, so it's not weakened at all. So, and the thickness of the plate was nearly the same as the thickness of the nut that was welded on the back, so it hasn't weakened it at all, but it has given me that extra 5mm of clearance that was needed on the other side to clear that engine mounting. So without doing that, the engine would not have fitted at all, because it would have jammed up against these extra wide cooling fins that are on the Vulcan engine that are not present on the ER6 engine. So that's the first fairly minor thing. Second thing, you can't really see so well inside here, but the top of the cam covers are different. So this is the cam cover for the ER6. Obviously it's made to fit the ER6 head. Now the Vulcan S engine has a different head and a different cam cover. Now that shouldn't be an issue, except that there's a plastic baffle plate that fits over here and directs air through the radiator and actually connects to the radiator. In fact, you can see it. You can see a bit of it over here. This is part of that plastic baffle plate. Now this one had a crack in it, so I repaired it with a bit of heavy duty epoxy, but then when it came to fitting it to the cylinder head, there was clearly a difference, so I had to cut a little bit off just to make a little bit of extra clearance on this side of the cylinder head. The mounting points were exactly in the same place, so there was no issue with it fitting in the correct place. The issue was that on the cam cover for the Vulcan, there's a raised section here, and I had to cut a tiny little bit off. It wasn't much, to be honest. It was only a really small amount, just to allow it to fit. Now it's in there and it fits perfectly well. But also on top, you've got your crankcase breather, and this connects to a hose that connects to the airbox via a solenoid. Now this is the one off the Vulcan engine, and as you can see, it's got a 90-degree bend in it. The one on the original engine just comes straight up, so I had to swap them over. Inside there's normally some reed valves, but simple enough job. If you've still got the old engine that came out the bike, you shouldn't have any problems with that. Then this here is the cover with what they call the external shifter mechanism. So you're probably familiar with that. Simple spring detent type shifter mechanism. Over here you've got your neutral sensor, and that senses off the end of the shift drum. So here's the shift drum. As you can see, on the end of that engages with this little guy here. There we go, and that little slot in there engages with this part of the end of the shift drum. So that's your neutral sensor. This is a pretty standard sort of gear selector shaft. Problem is, when you look at this particular ER6, this cover plate is quite different, because it uses a speed sensor that picks up off the end of the sprocket shaft, or the output shaft of the engine. So there was no provision here to mount that sensor. I can show you where that fits on the engine if we can spin this crankcase around. Right, so that's the other side of the engine. This is where your sprocket would live with your output shaft, and this is the cover in question. As you can see, this little guy fits over there, and there it's picking up your neutral. That would be the outer end of the shift drum. Your gear selectors in there. And all of that is the same, except this section here has some extra mounting points for the sensor that picks up the RPM of this shaft, and that's where your speed sensor comes from. So I think that it's an issue related to ABS. You'll probably find this type of cover on the ABS equipped models that don't need that sensor because they have sensing on the wheels, whereas this type, I would imagine with the non-ABS type, you would still have that sensor over there, which means a different cover. So it was a relatively simple case of swapping these two around and also swapping over that portion of the end of the shift drum, which is accessible from here. So it's not a problem to swap that over. So that's one of the other modifications that had to be made. One of the other ones I had to do was the thermostat housing on the side of the cylinder head. I swapped them over, but only because I think the pipe, the radiator hose, had kind of molded itself to fit the old one, and it wouldn't seal properly with the new one. So they're not identical, but they're so similar there's hardly any difference. They're interchangeable. But there was a small difference, I think, in the shape of this and the diameter, and because it was quite an old radiator hose, it really didn't want to seal against it. So I've replaced that. I swapped this over. It was a real bastard of a job to get in there and do it with the engine in the frame. So I should have checked that before I installed it, but other than that, it went okay. Yeah, so that's all pretty simple stuff, that. But what I did find that was a bit of a problem, or could have become a bit of a problem, was while I was working on this cover over here and messing about with the gear shift and making sure that this, when I replaced this little cover with the one off the original engine, and I had the selector in and I was moving the gear shaft, I noticed two things. Firstly, the Kawasaki have a neutral assist system, which means with the back wheel stationary or the output shaft stationary, you can't shift up into second gear. You can only go between first and neutral. And the other thing I noticed was that it was all the wrong way around. So that got me thinking that there was a difference in the gearbox. So after having a look at some pictures, it was pretty clear what was going on. Because the Vulcan S has forward controls, the gear shift mechanism is operated the opposite way around, whereas the standard ER6, your gear pedal is behind the shaft, whereas on the Vulcan it's in front of the shaft, obviously on the other side. So yeah, I mean, it would have been so easy if they'd just taken the linkage and flipped it over, but they didn't do that when they modified the engine for the Vulcan. Instead, they changed out the shift drum to operate the opposite way around. So without swapping them over, you'd find your gearing all the opposite way around. And you could probably get used to it, but I wouldn't recommend it. So that's the other thing that has to come out, which means the gearbox has to come out, along with the clutch and everything else. Now, fortunately, this engine has a cartridge style gearbox, so you don't have to take the engine apart. All you have to do is remove the clutch cover, remove the clutch, and you can remove the whole gearbox as a cartridge. Christ, I wish more people made motorbikes that way. So much easier than having to split the cases just for a flipping, just to change the shift drum. So I'll turn this engine around and I'll show you what that looks like. Right, so here you can see the crankcase, and that's where the oil pump would live. It's been removed. Don't have to remove the oil pump in its entirety, but I did anyway. And that is a great big hole where your gearbox would normally live. Now, So here we have the gearbox itself. As you can see, it's all mounted to this plate, which just goes in and fits in that area here. So not actually all that difficult to remove if you've got the right tools. I've already taken the shift drum out, but that would normally live there. Sit vertically and operate your selector forks over here. I did compare the two gearboxes side by side, and it looked to me like the gears were identical. The only difference was the drum. So that is the drum out of the original Vulcan S engine, and it's completely different to the drum that came out of the ER6 engine, which is now in the bike. So if you are going to put a Vulcan S engine in an ER6, you will have to change the drum over, or get used to shifting down for up and up for down, which I wouldn't want to do. But it's not that bad of a job. Just one thing to be careful of is this little washer over here. Because it's on the end of the output shaft, it's quite easy for it to stay stuck on that bearing over there, just being held in place with a bit of oil. So when you pull the whole gearbox out, it might stay behind and fall down. Now, there isn't a lot else that can fall down because the bearing is trapped. You've got your shafts, there's nothing holding them in place. So I found when I pulled the gearbox out, both shafts came out, the forks dropped down in there, and this washer also fell off. So when I did it the second time with the other engine, I made a point of getting my finger in there and grabbing that washer. You can fish them out. There's nothing really that's going to fall down except possibly these little guys. You don't want any of them going down there and then having to remove the sump, because if you can, try and block everything off with a bit of something so that it can't fall down there. But there are places where you just can't block it off. There's holes down the back where things can fall down into the sump. So just be prepared. You might have to get in there and fish some stuff out if you have to. Remove the sump to get to it, as you can see. But it's not too bad. I mean, it was so much easier than a Suzuki GS motor, which has to be split to get to the gearbox. So it wasn't too difficult to get to, and it could even be done with the engine in the bike, to be honest. I think if you look at this side of the engine here, if you were to remove the plastic cover, I think you could get all of this off with the engine still in the bike. So you can see why people want to use them for racing. One other issue I had was the exhaust mounting. The previous person who fitted this exhaust had tried to seal it with a gasket against this face here, which is obviously not a precision machined face, where it should be sealing against this face down here. A part of the problem was the fact that it didn't have the stock exhaust, and also the exhaust had been a bit modified and wouldn't have fitted correctly regardless of which cylinder head I used. But also a part of the problem was that the exhaust port diameters are different. The original ER6 exhaust has exhaust ports are 36 millimeters in diameter, whereas the Vulcan S has 42 millimeter diameter exhaust ports. So I did have to turn a simple aluminium spacer, partly because I was trying to adapt a modified exhaust to fit on, but I think something would have had to have also been done with a standard exhaust to get it to fit the larger diameter exhaust ports. I think some kind of ring spacer or something would be required to get it to center properly, and obviously you'd need to use a 42 millimeter gasket, but it all worked in the end, and it fits. It's not blowing, and it's clear of the engine. So I have heard that the Vulcan S engine has slightly fewer horsepowers. I've also heard that it has different fueling. So I don't know, to be fair, long term, how well it's going to play with the ECU from the ER6. I've ridden it. It runs well. It's got loads of power. It's nice and quiet. Incidentally, this is a 2019 engine with less than 5,000 miles on. So if you're going to swap out, you know, to be able to do that for less than the price of a fairly knackered old first generation ER6 engine with 50,000, 60,000 miles on, it's worth doing, I think. I have a lot of confidence in this engine because of its very low mileage and because it feels really good on the road. Apparently they have a heavier flywheel and possibly they have different valve timing, I don't know. If it was an issue, I was prepared to swap the cams out if necessary, because I do still have the cams from the old engine. So if there was an issue, I'd be quite happy to swap the cams out. That can be done with the engine in the frame, so it's not too much of a hardship, and you wouldn't need to take the head off and require a new head gasket or anything like that. So all in all, pretty easy engine to work on, and I'm using obviously throttle bodies and everything that was originally on the bike, and it all seems to fit. Everything fits, all the engine mountings line up. As I say, it's just that one issue of clearance on the other side, but yeah, other than that, it all seems pretty good. So yeah, like I say, I have ridden it, done about 25-30 miles on it since I put it back together. No issues at all. The gears go the right way, no weird noises, sounds nice and quiet, sounds great with that Black Widow exhaust on. So yeah, highly recommended if you can't find the engine you want. And I think it looks quite good with this bit of extra detail on the cylinder. So yeah, perfectly feasible. Just so you're aware, a few things that will need to change. The cover for the gear shift mechanism will definitely, the breather on top of the cam cover, the shift drum to get it shifting the right way around. The front engine mounting on the left hand side of the bike will need to be modified, and the plastic cover or baffle plate that attaches to the top of the cam cover will also need to be modified to fit. But I'll see if I've got any photos of that. I think I do. So it does mean the whole gearbox has to come out, but all in all, fairly easy engine to work on, so not a huge amount of hardship to do. So yeah, good luck with your project.
You're still indicating you, Wally.